Oh, sorry. And we've got Sydney Litterer from Michigan State University, who's going to kind of talk about her project. Yeah, feel free to start when you are ready.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sydney Litter. I am a doctoral student at Michigan State University, and today I'll be presenting on behalf of my project team, which includes Ryan Scrivens, Thomas Holt, Thomas Wojciechowski, and Richard Frank. Oops, sorry. There we go. So our project looked at how users' posting behavior and use of offensive language changed relative to forum norms as they engaged with a white supremacist forum, in this case, the forum Stormfront. And in order to analyze this, we conducted two different group-based trajectory analyses. So to provide some background on the existing literature, research into online forums and online communities suggests that these forums do function as a form of community in which users develop social relationships with people who share their values and norms. And because of these shared values, norms, as well as traditions and rituals, these forums can also be thought of as subcultures. And research suggests that subculture norms are not static, that they are actively negotiated through the interactions of community members. But those community members are in turn shaped by their interaction with others in the subculture. They learn the norms of their subculture, and they also deepen their commitment to the beliefs of that subculture. Research into white supremacy forums specifically suggests that there are a variety of patterns that can be identified in both the use of language and in behavior. Research into white supremacy forums posting activities suggests that most of the activity is driven by a very small subset of highly active users whose posts are longer and more extreme than other users. Other research has showed that there are patterns in negative discussions of Black, Jewish, and LGBTQ plus people on Stormfront, that those discussions follow distinct trajectories depending on which group is being targeted. And also, research into Iron March suggests that highly active, consistent users tended to become active in the forum earlier. And similarly, users of Fascist Forge, who were initially moderately or highly active, also tended to become active in the forum at an earlier point in time than users who had less initial posting frequency. So this study contributes to that literature by first exploring the use of threats by Stormfront users over time. A lot of the existing research has focused on things like slurs, profanity, and general negative sentiment towards others, rather than the use of threats. This study does include research on the use of slurs or profanity and links it to the use of threats over time. We also control for forum trends to understand how users' language and behavior change relative to forum norms. This is building on a lot of the prior research that looked at absolute changes over time in user engagement and language. So our data set consisted of posts made by 1,000 randomly selected Stormfront users. And for context, Stormfront is the oldest and largest racial hate site and one of the most influential white supremacy forums in the world. So because the forum has been around for a very long time, our posts spanned a long time frame, with people in the data set posting as early as January 2004 and as late as September 2021. And all of the posts that we use were posts that these users made within 12 months of the point in which they joined the forum. We used three measures to understand language behavior and language use. The measure of user behavior was their relative posting frequency per month, and the measures of language were the relative likelihood that their post contained vulgarity by month, which ended up being transformed for analysis, and then a transformed version of the relative likelihood posts contained threats by month. When I say that these variables are relative likelihoods and relative frequency, that is for whatever calendar month the user was posting in. For our analysis, we consider months relative to the point in which they joined the forum, but that's not how we created these relative measures. So our language measures were constructed through a multi-step process. We first processed posts using the Google Perspective API, which is initially intended for content moderation, and outputs the likelihood that a post contains a variety of different forms of offensive language, including the use of insults, identity attacks, threats, and profanity. Because we weren't sure to what degree these different measures measured similar concepts, we decided to go through a concept or a process of scale development, which started first with an exploratory factor analysis to understand the different factor structures that might be underlying these measures, and then a confirmatory factor analysis to identify the most appropriate factor structure. And because we did identify a factor underlying several of the indicators, we created a scale from those and looked at scale reliability. What we found was that 3 indicators, measures of the likelihood posts contained insults, profanity, and identity attacks, formed a highly reliable scale, a scale with a reliability of 0.91. So we averaged those and ended up using a separate measure of threat in our analysis because the confirmatory factor analysis suggested that while that was related, it did seem to be measuring a distinct concept. So as you can see here, the statistics are shown on the right for our untransformed variables. Our relative frequency variable has a very wide range, starting from -94, which means that there are people in the forum who are posting 94 times less per month than average, and ranging all the way up to 620 posts more per average in a month. So we had, particularly at the high end, a lot of outliers, a few people who were very, very active. And when you look at relative vulgarity and relative threat, those are all on a scale from -1 to 1 because we're subtracting one proportion from another. So our untransformed measures were all non-normal, and we ended up transforming the language measures in order to improve their normality by shifting them by a constant to obtain positive values and transforming them by a cubed root. We did not actually transform the posting frequency measures due to limitations in the modeling technique. There are a limited set of distributional assumptions that you can make with group-trace trajectory modeling, as well as a limited number of transformations that we could use. And we had some significant issues with model estimation and convergence. So as I mentioned, we conducted this analysis using group-based trajectory modeling. The model and modeling procedures are described in some detail in NEGIN 2005. And basic group-based trajectory modeling identifies latent clusters of individual trajectories for a single measure, but this has been extended into a dual trajectory analysis as well as multi-trajectory analysis. With dual trajectory analysis, you can look at trajectories for 2 related measures, and it first identifies trajectories for each measure independently, but also describes relationships between the trajectories found for each measure. So in analyzing posting frequency trajectories, as I said, we used only one indicator here, so we used a basic group-based trajectory model. Because of the large data range, we had some significant issues with convergence for our models, so we ended up using a ceiling value because we had a few just very active users, and most of the users actually had negative values for relative trajectory or for relative posting frequency. So we also used a censored normal distribution with the maximum value set of our ceiling value. And we ended up identifying a 2-group model with second-order polynomials. We identified this by comparing models using the Bayesian information criteria and fit statistics, including average posterior probabilities of assignment and odds of correct classification for each group identified. We also considered the explanatory utility of the different models. So here you can see the trajectories for our model. You can see that the vast majority of the forum users, consistent with prior research, are not very active. They're less active than average users in whatever month they're posting. But there is a very small set of users that starts off much more active than other users and gets even more active for several months before their activity starts to trail off. This slide shows that the frequency model fits the data well. All of our coefficients are significant, and the fit statistics are average posterior probabilities of assignment and odds of correct classification meet required thresholds, which for the former is 0.7 and for the latter is 5. So moving on to our language trajectories, because we had 2 indicators, we used a group-based dual trajectory model with our transformed data and a censored normal distribution. And we identified a model for each indicator that had 2 groups with polynomials of varying degrees. And this model was chosen using the Bayesian information criteria and those 2 fit statistics. So looking at our model of vulgarity, we can see that first there's a group that starts with a slightly elevated relative likelihood of using vulgarity in their posts, but then decreases towards the average for the forum. However, that decrease is quite slow. It takes place over an entire year. And then the other group, despite an initial slight increase at the beginning, is fairly stable for most of the year, stabilizing at about 10% lower likelihood than average of using vulgarity. Like our frequency model, this vulgarity model fits the data well, our coefficients are significant, and the fit statistics also meet required thresholds. These are our trajectories for the likelihood that posts contain threat. And you can see that there is even more long-term stability for this variable. And the difference between the groups is also less pronounced. There's one group whose use of threats consistently matches the average for the forum over time, and another group that is consistently about 4 to 5% less likely to be using threats. Again, the model fits the data well with significant coefficients and sufficient fit statistics. So this slide shows, and I'm sorry if things are blocked a little bit here by Zoom, but this slide basically shows the overlap in group membership across the two language indicators that we used. And what it says is that individuals who are less likely than the average to use vulgarity are also, for the most part, less likely to use threats and vice versa. We can see also in the bottom table that about half of users have a low, stable likelihood of using both vulgarity and threats. And slightly under half of users have a much closer to average likelihood of using threats, although for vulgarity, one group starts slightly elevated and then decreases towards the average. So looking at what these results mean relative to the existing literature, this suggests that, as literature has found, indeed, a small subset of highly active users are driving the majority of the engagement in this space, and most Stormfront users have very limited engagement. Compared to that, there's a much more even split in the use of offensive language. We saw that it was about 50-50 between people who were using much less likely to use offensive language than average, and then people who much more closely followed forum norms. We also see that the use of threats appears to be very, very closely linked to the use of other forms of offensive language, such as profanity and slurs that have been studied in prior work. Kleinberg et al. Found change in Stormfront user engagement in language over time using a absolute measure, or a variety of absolute measures of engagement in language use, which suggests that the users that we find that are following stable trajectories relative to the forum average are still changing in their posting behavior and their use of language, so they may still be influenced by factors shaping broader forum trends. However, the relatively flat trajectories that we see for a lot of these groups suggest that the process of learning subcultural norms either may be slow, take place over a long time, or just may not be well reflected in the measures that we used. All right, are there any questions? I am actually going to stop sharing my screen if that's okay, so I can see everybody.
Thank you for your presentation. I'll just open it up to the room. Are there any questions? Unfortunately, I don't think we have any questions. I think there was a problem with the stream, so there were no questions coming in online either. But thank you very much for your presentation. If you have
No
any more
problem.
final comments or anything you'd like to say.
If anybody has, I don't know, can the stream see the chat? Do you know for Zoom?
Yeah, so the stream was streaming on YouTube.
Oh, gotcha.
The
Um,
Zoom is just a webinar, so there's no comments from the chat.
Gotcha. I can, if you would like, just pop my email back up on screen in case anyone wanted to email me any pressing questions they had.
Yeah, that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I will just share my screen one more time. All right. Yes, you can contact me at literer@msu.edu if you have any questions about this work. We're still working on finalizing all of our results and writing up our paper.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes, no problem. It was a pleasure to present to all of you.
Thank you. It's great to hear from you.
All right. Should I go ahead and hop off Zoom? Oh, I can't hear you anymore.
Oh, yeah, you can if you like to.
All right. Have a nice day.
Goodbye, you too.
Bye.